I'm delighted to have David here tonight. He and I are colleagues at the Discovery Institute. He's also a friend and advisor. He's the Jewish uncle I never had but always wanted. And have had a lot of fun working on this issue together. David has a fantastic book out called The Devil's Delusion, which is out of print. And there's some publishers looking at it, trying to get it back into print. You may have heard a little bit about it this morning. But David's background is as a mathematician and as a philosopher. And David, you became skeptical about Darwinian evolution fairly early on, well before, there's a country song down here that says, I was country before country was cool. You were skeptical about Darwin before there was any ID movement, and what were some of the considerations that led you to that?
Well, let me impart a secret. I published my first paper that dealt directly or indirectly with Darwinian evolution in 1973. Long time ago. And I published it directly because I had been thinking about topics in automata theory, machine theory, and I was very much influenced by mathematical linguistics. My great buddy Marco Schutzenberger was a mathematician, and Noam Chomsky and Schutzenberger were working together on the description of natural languages by a formal mathematical method. And I tried to apply exactly the same description of certain structures in the English grammar to what I then, in 1973, understood about molecular biological systems. And what did I discover? That it was impossible, not just difficult, but impossible to use the simplest level of explanation, so-called finite state automata, where one thing happens after another. Typical Darwinian progression, small incremental continuous improvements in the structure of an organism. As soon as you tried to specify that very rigorously, you discovered, well, it doesn't work. It doesn't look good. It doesn't make sense. What you need is at least, and this was 1973, all this is far in the past now, and I'm sure the methods have been improved, but I think the conclusion is sound. You need at least what's called a push-down storage automata. You need some forward-looking memory. Let me give you a simple example. You take the English sentence, the old man came. And you can say that sentence is made by first fishing the word the from a vat. And that word determines the next one. It can be old, sprightly, courteous, ancient, whatever. But it determines the next word. And then the third word, man, is determined by the second word, and the verb at the end is determined by the third word. Very simple system. It's a very Darwinian system. You can imagine Darwinian evolution producing the sentence, the old man came. Turns out English doesn't work that way, and no other natural language does either. For example, the old man who had snorted the roses in the hall came. Now listen to the balance of that sentence. The old man, comma, who had snorted the roses in the hall, comma, came. There is no immediate dependence. When you get to the verb, you have to go all the way back to the beginning of the sentence and keep that in memory before you'll understand what the sentence says. That can't be produced by a Darwinian mechanism or a finite state automata. And the great work in this field was done by Noam Chomsky as early as 1958 or 59. It was a revolution in graduate school when I was there. Just amazing. And contrary to what all the behavioral psychologists thought, and behaviorism in psychology is simply Darwinism in psychology. Contrary to what all the people like B.F. Skinner thought, or W.V.O. Quine, a great philosopher, English and no other natural language behaves in this way. You need something like a push-down storage automata for a formal description. And of course, that set my imagination on fire. You had your experience, yeah. I had mine, and I got together with a very good biochemist, George Pechenik, and we were going to publish revolutionary papers, and nothing ever happened.
Ruin your careers in so doing, yeah.
Oh, Pechenik went on to a great career, but he didn't go on to a great career criticizing Darwin, that's for sure. He's some bigwig in an oil company. Oh, amazing, an oil company.
Yeah. I'm intrigued by this phrase, forward-looking memory, because one of the things that the mechanism of natural selection can't do by definition
absolutely impossible.
is have foresight. And yet every simulation that's done in a computer of Darwinian evolution seems to require that foresight. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It is assiduously packed into the simulation itself. I mean, I think we can say as a kind of general principle where Darwinian computer theoretic simulations work, they're not Darwinian. And when they don't work, What they require is the addition of forward-looking memory, some capacity to store information about the future. This is simply missing from Darwinian theory. It's absent a concept. There's a hole where there should be something substantial. And it's not a trivial hole. It's a very significant hole.
Richard Dawkins, I think the two of you have debated in the past, but he has a simulation where he attempts to do this, where he wants the computer to produce the phrase, "me thinks it's like a weasel," but tell us.
I wrote about this before Dawkins published his stuff, and many people were arguing like Dawkins. Dawkins has become the most well-known, indeed notorious. He took a phrase from Hamlet, "me thinks it's like a weasel," and he said, how would, it's an ironic phrase for Richard Dawkins to use. God punishes every man according to a special plan. And he said, what would be required in order to achieve this sentence from a random group of letters or words using just Darwinian principles? And he said, well, suppose we set up a computer and we randomly varied a sample sentence, which was just gibberish. And every time we accidentally came close to the sentence, the target sentence, "me thinks it's like a weasel," we would keep those changes and allow the computer simulation to go on until we converged to the target sentence itself. And of course, he was able to show with no very great difficulty that indeed, using those constraints, you could achieve convergence to a target sentence much more quickly than you could by looking at it randomly. I never understood what he was up to.
What's the fallacy in that, though?
I'm not sure it's a fallacy because obviously his theory is correct. It's simply not Darwinian because what he has, speaking technically, is a built-in metric, which is just a way of measuring the distance between what he gets randomly and what he needs to get. And speaking informally, he has a fixed goal in mind. Now, not necessarily the goal of that sentence, but if you disregard that goal and say, well, any English sentence will do, the problem becomes progressively more difficult, not less difficult. Because then you have to build in constraints which will tell you when you've reached an English sentence and when not, and no one knows how to do that.
So he's selecting for future function, not actual function. There's no actual function being selected. He's selecting.
It's all taking place in the future.
In the future.
In the future.
As if the computer somehow knows, which of course natural selection doesn't know.
No, but the rest of life does.
Yeah, the rest of life does. Yeah. It was one of our colleagues, Paul Nelson, says if you get it wrong, life has a way of talking back. It says, hey, I needed that. I'm dead.
Exactly. So I published that criticism, and people who understood the discussion agreed with me. Mm-hmm. And of course, people who didn't. Ça va sans dire.
David, let's talk a little bit about the Dawkins is also known for this book, The God Delusion. There's this whole publishing phenomenon of the new atheism, and you've written this wonderful piece, the Devil's Delusion, Scientific Atheism and Its Pretensions. Why did you decide to take these guys on?
I wrote a book called The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions, and the question is, why did I decide to take these people on? I'm assuming that vanity is not the answer you wanted. But look, we're among friends, right? And vanity is a part. Anybody who writes has that as a motive. I'm not trying to present a false face. It's not false humility. Yeah, I wanted to get my name known. I wanted to make a big stir. I wanted to attack these guys. And that is the expression of vanity, nothing else. But I also thought this is an important topic. I still do. And I wanted to register not necessarily a dissident, but a different opinion. And that's what I set about doing in the book. And I think a different opinion, a heterodox opinion, is badly needed because atheism has become, in the secular West, certainly in France and in the rest of Europe, I don't know about Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe, the United States, it's become the default position among intellectuals. Not only the default position that is instinctively reached, but an unthinking position. By unthinking, I mean it's not historically informed and it's not analytically informed either. And people who espouse atheism, say over cocktail parties or dinner parties at Cambridge or San Francisco or New York, are typically flabbergasted to discover that their beliefs are wafer thin and their arguments are generally puerile. And I wanted to say that.
It was a good time for a dramatic pause just to reflect on that last phrase. That was wonderfully stated. David
I'm sorry, I can't see.
Yeah, David had a fall and has got a
Defeating a terrorist plot.
Yeah.
I happened to trip over my own feet.
I was talking a little bit this morning and did in my introduction about the argument from design based on the anthropic fine-tuning, all this exquisite fine-tuning. And one of the counter-arguments to that is the idea that there were billions and billions and billions of other universes out there, these various physical models that generate what's called the multiverse. And you talk in your book a bit about the multiverse, and what's your assessment of that as a contrary hypothesis?
Well, you need a special scale to rank the multiverse, the scale of the preposterous. If the doctrine that we all have parents who are ducks comes in at 100, the multiverse comes in at slightly more. It is one of those strange phenomena in the history of thought. I mean, you see the most intelligent people on the planet, and that's sincerely meant. These guys who are doing quantum cosmology.
They're smart.
Very smart, very smart. Nonetheless, like a herd of individuals, they all are instinctively moving toward the same conclusion, which involves embracing any doctrine, hypothesis, or belief other than the most obvious one. It's a remarkable feat, not of indoctrination, nobody is forcing these guys to do that, but of compliance to a party line. And the party line is, God forbid we should mention anything except a hypothesis that does not invoke a designer or some form of supreme intelligence or some transcendental entity, anything except the obvious one. And they are reacting this way because they've been properly chastened. You know, when the Big Bang hypothesis became more than a hypothesis, when it became part of the settled body of theoretical physics, a great many physicists said, you know, the universe came into existence 15 billion years ago. It sort of erupted into existence from nothing. And some of the physicists with more than a nodding literary acquaintance with the great texts of Western history said, you know, I've heard that before. Can't place it, but it's got that ring in the beginning. And they began talking amongst themselves. And one of the physicists said to the other, you know, that's something that was written a long time ago, not only in one place, but in every single serious creedal system. There is reference to the event by which the universe was constructed, and it's remarkably similar to what modern physics shows. That was too much for the community of physicists. It was really an indignity. First of all, that a lot of dopey theologians may have anticipated the Big Bang. What an outrage. Chutzpah, as we say in Greek. That couldn't be. Interdit. But in the second place, it conflicted with everything the community, the scientific community in the West, took to be their prerogative. They would decide what the physical world looks like. They would answer all questions. To the scientists would repair all inquiring intellects, and anybody who didn't like it, well, just too bad. And here is a conclusion that didn't seem quite agreeable. So an incredible amount of effort has been devoted, say since 1971, 1972. How many years is that?
38,
yeah,
37, something, yeah.
I don't do that kind of math.
It's okay, neither did Einstein.
Yeah. We're brain workers. We leave that to other people. Yeah. An incredible amount of work has been devoted to rejecting this palpable and obvious conclusion. Well, if you find the existence of the universe a remarkable mystery, some sense of that mystery can be dispelled if you say to yourself, well, it's not just one universe. There are all sorts of universes lying around out there, loitering as it were. And there's nothing mysterious about our universe, because any property that we find desperately enigmatic about the world in which we live is sure to arise by chance just so long as we have sufficiently many universes to make the play of the dice agreeable. Hence the hypothesis that we live not in the universe, but in one universe, and that there are indefinitely many other universes out there. And that principle, the doctrine of the multiverse, multi-universe, goes along with a number of other nonsensical doctrines, the anthropic cosmological principle, for example. And this is not the time, I think, to go on an extended exploration of the anthropic cosmological principle, nor the doctrine of the multiverse. My point is otherwise. I think you have a genuine example in the flight of the community of physicists from any confrontation with the obvious to a variety of metaphysical speculations that strain credulity of a relatively familiar phenomenon in the history of thought, that is party line orthodoxy. We've seen it with Marxism, we certainly saw it with Freudianism, and it continues to this day within the sciences. Very interesting.
David, some of these physicists have been quite candid about their
Oh,
reasons
yeah.
for positing this. There's a quote in your book from is it Leonard Susskind?
Leonard Susskind is a terrifically smart mathematical physicist at Stanford, very aggressive, Brooklyn-born, nothing but contempt for anyone else. He said, if we don't come up with the right scenario, these guys are going to crucify us. And by us, he means the physicists, and these guys, he means people like Steve and me. He's absolutely right.
Yeah, if it's not the multiverse, he says it's intelligent design, and we simply can't have that.
No, unacceptable.
So there's got to be billions and billions of other
I heard
universes.
Dr. Berlensky mention clueless theologian, and I felt like that was my invitation to join you all. I'm not sure I am the latter, but I'm definitely the former.
You can stay standing if you like. Let
Let me ask this. I think the reason we had such a great response, and this is a key question, if you can only hear one, I want you to hear this. I think the reason there was such a tremendous response tonight is because people who have believed in a creation explanation have been bullied by science for the better part of the last 150 years. They've been told that they are infantile in their understanding, that they're anti-intellectual, and that they believe in a child's fairy tale. So what would you say to them? Because clearly we're not scientists, and we cannot enter into a conversation to tit for tat on science, but to folks that have felt oppressed by this idea that only fools believe in the myth, the God delusion, if you will. What would you say to them?
First thing I would say is so what? Infantile, narrow-minded, foolish, childish, okay, so. The question isn't whether it is infantile, childish, narrow-minded, whether it's something that one could not expect to see in sophisticated circles. Those are points in its favor. Surely we understand that. The question is, what portion of the truth resides in these claims? That's a different question.
Okay. And so what you're saying, though, from a scientific perspective, that the truth is overwhelmingly crying out for this intelligence, this singularity which is intelligent.
No, I'm not saying anything from the
I didn't
scientific
think so, which is
perspective.
why I asked.
Because there is no such thing as a scientific perspective. There is only the perspective of informed, commonsensical, rational inquiry.
Wonderful.
There is no method of science. I mean, nothing that doesn't apply to golf as well. The whole thing is a charade to that extent. It's a structure of considerable grandeur but great emptiness. There are various scientific theories, and our responsibility, and I mean everybody in this audience, me, you included, is to examine these theories and ask ourselves as honestly as possible, do they answer to the deepest needs of men and women? If not, get rid of them.
Steve
If
and
so,
Mike?
yeah, exactly. What's wrong with that? We're looking at certain theories. Mike Behe's looking at theories in molecular biology. Steve is looking at information. As it's applied to these systems, I have slightly different interests. And if we come up with conclusions that are not entirely consonant or consistent with the standard scientific orthodoxy, tant pis, tough.
Todd, I think one of the wonderful things about the book that you're holding in your hands, granted it's yeah.
You can't buy it. And it was interesting, David, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason this is out of print, usually books go out of print because no one's buying them.
No, it's sold out. That's why it went out of print.
And so why doesn't the publisher who wants money, why don't they put it back in print?
They don't like my associations.
Yes. In other words, they are embarrassed that this would be put off as science underneath their...
No, just embarrassed because of my association with the Discovery Institute.
Okay.
Simple as that.
So what?
Can I say something for the book, though?
Sure.
Well, I think the short answer to your question is it's time to stop being intimidated. And I think the devil's delusion is a lucid, short, very readable, very funny, but very persuasive and powerful defense of that common sense principle. You know, the people that obscure common sense with talk of multiverses and quantum cosmological ideas and string theoretic landscapes, it's time to stop being intimidated by folks like that and ask, well, do these things really make sense? And David does a masterful job of deflating the pretensions that underlie a lot of that kind of obfuscation.
I think Dr. Johnson made the point superbly. You know, he was talking to Boswell and he said, "Sir, you must clear your mind of Kant. Stop talking rubbish if you can possibly help it. The scientific community talks a lot of rubbish. Look, they're only human. There's nothing wrong with talking rubbish, but there's nothing wrong with pointing out that it is rubbish either."
All right. I want to get this. I don't want to miss it. Steve, earlier you said there's 3 different definitions of evolution. And the second one, I think, created a little bit of a stir when the idea that we don't have an issue with common descent or common ancestry. And explain that. That doesn't mean that you believe that all of us have come from, all the kinds have come from a similar kind, or does it? I want to let you speak to that.
I have an issue with universal, I think you got me hooked up, David, but I have an issue with it. I know too much about fossils, for example. The major groups of organisms come suddenly into the rock record, the insects, the phyla in the Cambrian. I used to say to my students, you shall know them by their euphemisms. The Cambrian explosion, the marine Mesozoic revolution, the angiosperm big bloom, the mammalian radiation. I don't think there's good evidence for universal common ancestry. But the point I was making is that that's not what the theory of intelligent design is addressing. We're addressing a different question. We're addressing a more fundamental issue of whether there is or is not design in life and in the universe, and whether or not you can tell from the scientific evidence. So there's 3 facets of Darwinism: change over time, universal common ancestry, and the idea that a purely undirected mechanism produces the appearance of design. We're taking on that third, and we think most fundamental and important proposition. That once we get that one settled, the rest of the stuff will fall in place.
Mike, do you want to jump in on that at all?
The reason we focus on just the point of intelligent design, or at least my reason, is that it's the easiest. It's the easiest. If you can remember to my talk, I showed the Far Side cartoon with the jungle trap. And you can ask yourself a whole lot of interesting questions that you'd like to know the answer to. Like, who made that trap? You know, maybe it was a native of the jungle. Maybe it was one of the explorers. You know, and the guy who turned around and said, I wasn't in front. I didn't want to be in front. Or when was it made? Maybe it was made yesterday or a month ago. So you can ask a lot of who, what, when, where, how questions, and you need more information to answer those. But simply looking at the system right there in front of you, you look at that trap and immediately you know it was designed. Because the evidence for design is the system itself. The history of the system and so on is an interesting question, but you can tell that something was designed just by essentially looking at it. And so it's the easiest question to address. It's also the one that the evolutionists, the Darwinists, most want to avoid. They'd be happy to talk about any other question except how in the world could these complex machines and systems have come about without intelligence.
Because undirected natural cause is the foundation of Darwinian theory and science.
Absolutely.
So, Dr. Berlinski?
Well, if you'll permit me, I have a slightly different perspective on that question, but I think the question is essential. And just imagine you're walking in the desert, right? And you're walking with a Darwinian biologist, and you come across a termite mound. You know, termite mounds are fairly complicated structures. They have many tunnels. They have elaborate construction. You say to the Darwinian biologist, how did that come about? And he says, well, the termites made it. Good answer. The termites did make it. The termites are perfectly capable of making termite mounds. You go a few miles further and you come across a nuclear fusion reactor. A massive thing sitting there in the desert, gleaming pipes, ducts, ceiling, waterworks, producing steam, generating electricity. And you turn to the Darwinian biologist and you say, you know, here we are in the desert, there's a nuclear fusion reactor. How did that come about? And the guy says, well, termites made it. you know that's not the right answer. You just know that's not the right answer. But the interesting case is one intermediate between these two. You're in the desert again, and you see something. That's all I'm going to tell you. You see something. And you turn to the Darwinian biologist and say, how did that appear? And the guy says, it was the Darwinian process. What's wrong with that answer? Which is the answer that has been classically given by Darwinian biology. What's wrong with that answer is the description, I saw something, is not complete enough, it's not specific enough, so that any answer is logically possible. In that sense, when Darwin proposed a mechanism for evolution in 1859, he was looking through the wrong end of the telescope. Because we have not, 150 years later, been able to specify the structures in the cell with that degree of sophistication and precision that would enable us to say, yes, that was a Darwinian process. Darwin was looking through the wrong end of the telescope, so are Darwinian biologists. The question that Darwin attempted to solve may be perhaps solved in 500 years. Now is not the time when it admits of a solution. We have not been able scientifically or rationally to describe the structures that we see, certainly not in molecular biology. The only honest thing that we can say is they're stupefying in their complexity. But if they're stupefying in their complexity, we cannot characterize that complexity. There is no theoretical model that is adequate to the task of explaining their emergence. That's a logical point. I think it's a powerful point.
And what you're saying is you don't need to be a scientist to grasp that. It is in your face. And in fact, all the mountain of words and theory does is obscure the obvious.
I think that's largely true. Anybody who's looked in the eyes of an infant knows that's true. No way to characterize the intelligence that one sees there.
Can I cue David up on another aspect of this common ancestry question? The poster child of transitional intermediate forms in Darwinian biology today is the transition from a hippopotamus-like land-dwelling creature to the modern whale. And David has asked some, I think, penetrating questions about the plausibility of that having to do with the anatomical changes that would be required. What could you say about that?
I've been thinking about this and remarking casually about this for about 20 years, ever since I first heard this incredible scenario that the whale, huge big thing, lives in the ocean, had its origins in some dim, dweebish, land-going, grass-munching creature. I said on the internet once it was probably a cow, and everybody, oh no, what do you know? It's not a cow at all, it's a moose. I don't care what you call it. The question is, what does it take to transform a land-dwelling creature into a sea-dwelling creature? Or, if you want an analogous question, what does it take to transform a 1976 Chevrolet Camaro into a submarine? It's the same question. It's the same question.
Or an ape to a man?
No, this question is more specified because we have a much better intuition about the changes. We know just what it would take to take a Camaro and make a submarine, a whole lot of work. But my question wasn't that this story was plausible or implausible. I have no interest in that question. My question was rather, do we have any quantitative measure of the number of changes, just anatomical changes? After all, we take a cow or a moose, the first thing we got to do is make it waterproof. How do we go about making a mammal waterproof? Not a simple business. The skin is a complicated organism. How do we teach it to breathe 500 miles under the water? How far down do whales go? I'm in the ballpark, right? How do we get its blow spout or whatever those things use to the top of its head from the bottom of its head? How do we persuade this creature to give up eating grass and go munch whatever whales munch? Can we come up with a numerical estimate of the number of changes? And I said, you know, I have no idea. These are very complicated questions in morphology and comparative anatomy. But I was able to say, well, you know, back of the envelope, about 50,000. Say it's wrong. Say it's 5,000, 500,000. I don't know, but you don't know either. The point is, when you go to the paleontological textbooks, the question, how many fossils do we see that fit this pattern? And how many fossils might we expect rationally to fit this pattern? That question is never asked. Never asked. You go to the leading experts on caudate paleontology, James Carroll, a wonderful scientist. I looked through his textbook. Yeah, I understand there are all sorts of intermediates like Ambulocetus natans that have been discovered, and those are wonderful confirmations of Darwinian theory. There is an intermediate sequence, but there are only 7 of them. If there are 50,000 changes, what happened to the remaining 49,000 changes that should be in the fossil record? Can we explain that away? Is it plausible? It is plausible. My point is the question is not properly asked. It's a sign of intellectual flabbiness in Darwinian theory, one of many.
Okay, guys, we're going to end at 9:15. We're going to make ourselves more available. I want to say we're going to throw Ray to the lions. Here we've got this panel of 3, and then it's going to be Ray alone on Tuesday. So you're going to have all those text messages to chew through and get after it. But Ray is a very capable scientist and philosopher and able to do that with us. Now, here's the last 2 questions I want to ask. One, what is the best argument against intelligent design?
Look around.
People, is that what you're saying?
The world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead,
Well,
Mike.
the argument from evil comes up quite a bit.
And one of the things that's not, well, go ahead, Mike. Were you going to expound on that?
Yeah, why did my mother die? I've had people ask me that, and they say, you say that this was designed. My mother died of cancer last year. How could that be designed?
Yeah. How could an intelligent, especially a benevolent designer, as the Christian would represent, or the theologian, be any part of this design? So it's really a question of theodicy more than it is a question of creation.
They're of a part, these questions. We find it very difficult to reconcile ourselves with the world as it is. There's no question that as human beings we do. Sin and suffering are overwhelming.
We were talking
Can
today.
I take a stab at that from about the rhetorical framing of that? That question is put to us, obviously raises a theological question. There's an artificial restraint on the debate that says that anything that has a theistic implication is not scientific. So people they think when they raise that question that there's a kind of a gotcha for anyone who's in favor of intelligent design. But I think to answer that, you have to bring in a theological perspective. And I think the Judeo-Christian biblical perspective is that you ought to expect 2 things in life, not one. You ought to expect evidence of design, but you ought to expect evidence of decay as well. There's something wrong with the world that wasn't intended. And if you're artificially prevented from giving a theological answer to what is in essence a theological question, then the ID perspective always looks deficient. But if we get rid of that artificial restraint and say we're going to follow the truth wherever we happen to find it, whatever disciplinary heading it falls under, whether that's science, philosophy, theology, I think there are reasonable, coherent perspectives on that.
There's an even better answer. It's an answer to the question, why is man's lot so miserable? Where wert thou when I created the universe?
Yeah. So you're saying the question that God himself asked to Job, where art thou? And so who is this that darkens counsel with words without knowledge?
Exactly. That will do as well as any other answer, right? I mean, there are questions we can't answer.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the other famed neo-atheists today is, we've already mentioned him, is Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens. And I was recently in a room with Hitchens where he himself said, to your point, Steve, leaving the discussion about evidences for origins, if I was going to suggest there's a problem with your designer, it's the way that he lets this world drift to decay. But he said, I would agree that if the Christian story was proven to be true, it gives a compelling and acceptable explanation for the problem of evil, a congruent explanation of which I provide no other. But because I reject the Christian explanation, I therefore reject the whole thing out of hand. But he himself acknowledges if the theistic answer is true, it does answer the question that's presented to intelligent design.
Coherent. It's
Yes,
amazing
logically
some
coherent.
of the concessions that are granted on the ride home from the debate with these guys. I mean, I could tell you some interesting stories. So the difference between the podium presentation and what one of my students called the 4 o'clock in the morning questions, they have them too.
Yeah.
That's true for every participant in the debate.
Yeah.
Everybody feels the same way. What we say in public, we say with enormous confidence. What we say to ourselves at 4 o'clock in the morning is full of doubt and uncertainty.
Let me just do this. To honor your time and theirs, let's just join them in an expression of thanks for their stewardship of life and time this evening. Yeah, gentlemen, I think the response that you're getting right now is really an expression of, I think, the relief that Dr. Williams, you said you shouldn't feel this. I mean, trust yourself. Don't let us overcomplicate things that are self-evident. Look at the baby, which is really an argument from Psalm 139, that you can see what is there. But I think what you're hearing us say is you guys can look through telescopes and microscopes that we cannot and have discussions on a field which we are not welcomed into. And what you're saying is, even there, you have no reason to shrink back. And that is our expression of thanks for your serving well on a portion of the battlefield that we have not been asked to march. I would encourage you to take advantage of the work that these men have done through the devil's delusion, through the signature of the cell, through Darwin's black box. Find these materials, avail yourself to them, use their arguments, and let them argue with their PhDs. Let them argue with the Nobel scientists that are on the Descent from Darwin list and others that themselves have made the case that you cannot make from a lack of investing and stewarding your life that way. You have gifts. You develop them, and you put them to work as these men had, and others will be as encouraged by you as you have been by them this evening. So may they stand before you and applaud you for your faithfulness, for being effective in the battle that you are in. And again, men, we want to thank you and express our heartfelt thanks by both reading and learning from your materials, making ourselves attentive to them, and by laboring in our part of the battlefield. One last time, we thank you for coming. And we'll see you on Tuesday, and thank you. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.